Ryan, thank you so much for coming here. I want to introduce you for people that may not know you. Ryan is an investor entrepreneur and an entrepreneur. He's the co-founder and CEO of Primer. Primer believes that kids are remarkable and that the American education system underestimates them. Primer investors include the best uh, investors, and they are Founders Fund, Khosla Ventures, Ryan, Peterson, Amjad, and others. Thank you so much for talking to me and taking the time.
Yeah, thanks for
Let's
having me.
Yeah, thank you. Let's jump in. So, in the mission of primary is to take kids seriously and believing that they are remarkable, and that the American education system underestimates them. It's in the primary mission statement. What are the problems in the education system here in the US? I mean, I think there is a tweet that you mentioned the expenditure and how well kids do. Can you elaborate a little bit more about what's going on there?
Yeah, so I mean, we could talk about this on the tactical level. We could talk about it more theoretical. Let me know where you want to go. But I mean, we basically talking about the primary mission statement. We are very big believers in the agency of kids, and so we we think a lot about autonomy, putting kids in the driver's seat, giving them control over how they spend their time within the school day, the types of things they work on. And we have a giant neon sign in our office that says "Take kids seriously." And I just really believe that that is it's much abstract from the tactical things that you're mentioning, but that is sort of like a sort of founding principle of Primer. And so when we think about how we design educational experiences, design the microschools, student-teacher interactions, parent-teacher interactions, parent-student interactions, taking kids seriously is the foundation of all that. So in some ways, you could say, I think that where the American education system got lost is really just the stripping of agency from kids. And in some ways, it's we can go as deep on this as you want, but it's very difficult. If you were trying to design a single education system that could be funded by the government, that would be homogeneous across every state and work for tens of millions of kids, it's very difficult to do that. It's very difficult to come up with any homogeneous system that would work for tens of millions of kids for almost anything, much less like their K through 12 education. And so I understand why it's sort of industrialized. I don't think I don't think it's creating optimal outcomes for kids, and we can talk about those outcomes. But I think that one of the things that's often lost in these debates is it is just a huge number of kids that we've decided in the U.S. that the federal government is going to be federal government sort of mandating, and state governments fund and local governments fund. It's a huge number of kids that we've decided are going to go through this sort of public system. And so in some ways, the standardization and industrialization were inevitable as downstream, sort of the way that would be executed once that decision was made.
Interesting. Can you go a little bit more into the details? I thought it was fascinating in terms of spending and how well kids are doing. Like, spending doesn't necessarily translate to actual results, right?
Yeah, so we spend, it depends on what bucket of spend you want to lump into it, but if you include all educational spend, it's about $1.5 trillion a year for K through 12. If you include more like just what you would consider like tuition, so not like auxiliary things like tutoring, et cetera, it's closer to $1 trillion a year. So we're talking about like 5, 6, 7 times more than all SaaS software subscriptions
Wow.
combined. So it's just it's an enormous market, an enormous amount of spend. And depending on the school, obviously per pupil spending varies by the district. So individual schools are funded through a combination, depending on the school, whether it's charter, public, pure play public, charter, whatever, is funded by the local government via taxes, usually property taxes, but there's varying different ways to fund the schools. There's state funding, and then there's also sometimes federal funding that gets involved. And so there's school districts where they're spending $25,000, $30,000, $35,000 per pupil all in, and still getting atrocious results. And so it's not my view is that it is not a function of purely like, hey, we just need to increase spending on kids and then on per pupil spending, and then that's going to drive better results, because we've seen that's not working. And so there's something structurally that's off that more money is not just going to solve.
Interesting. And you mentioned there are different systems, right? Like there's charter schools, and they're like traditional public schools. What are the main
Yep.
differences? And are certain systems, are kids in certain systems performing better in terms of score? So when you say they're not doing well, I would guess you're referring to the fact that you can measure in terms of scores, right? Like reading scores, math scores, and things like that. Is that right? And how do they work, these different systems?
Yeah. So on the scores, there's a bunch of different ways to slice the data. There's a report that there's something called the National or Nation Report Card that the government releases, which has basically it's like grade level proficiency for certain grades. And they look at what they call like national proficiency levels. And so you could put it in the show notes, but I think it's in fourth grade. I think it was something like 65% of fourth graders were not proficient at reading and math. And something like 70% of eighth graders were not proficient on reading and math. So we're not talking about like, 15% of students aren't on grade level. We're talking about the majority of students are not testing as proficient in not just like, social studies or these sort of auxiliary subjects, but like core things like reading and math that are like direct inputs to their success in the rest of their academic career and the rest of their life. So that's and I would actually argue, we can talk about this more, that there's even more important things than the academic outcomes for some of these kids. So if you're in an environment, in my opinion, if you're in a school where you're getting bullied all the time, you're exposed to violence, you don't feel safe, you feel like you have to go, sort of have these sort of what I would consider very toxic behaviors in order to fit in. I think that is as bad or worse for you in terms of like your human formation as a human and the rest of what the impact on the rest of your life than being behind academically would be. And so all the data around and all the conversation around outcomes is not even really tracking those kind of things that are much harder to quantify. As far as your first question, so the vast majority of schools in the US are either private, public, or charter. And charter schools are still, most people would consider them public schools, but they're very heavily debated. And so public schools and charter schools are funded in different ways. So it depends on the charter school, depends on the public school. But usually charter schools are a combination of government money, and then sometimes they'll raise private money as well. And then public schools, obviously there's really small fundraising and stuff, but they are primarily funded by the government, state, local governments. And then there's private schools that are almost always entirely funded by tuition, plus they'll often do private fundraisers as well. And so that's parents paying for their kid to go to school and then also making additional donations to usually cover additional spending or scholarships, things they want to offer.
Interesting. So you talked a little bit about how you can measure kids and how they are doing in terms of proficiency, reading, math skills, and things like that. How does that compare? How does the American system compare to other countries? And maybe like I've seen stats that for example, for wealth generation, you can separate into different groups, right? So like if you look at like Japanese Americans compared to people in Japan, they may do it better in wealth generation or things like that. But is there like how does the US compare to countries like Singapore, Japan, and other countries like that? Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a bunch of different ways to slice the data, and I'm not an expert on every, all the international education systems. But the general headline is that based on how the countries that you mentioned, in how many of them would define academic outcomes, so their equivalent of the national report card, they're getting much higher outcomes per dollar spent on a per pupil basis. And there's all sorts of, this is all very heavily debated, and certainly countries like Japan that have a very different demographic makeup and have a very different national identity and culture around these things, and education in general. Their approach to education in Singapore is very similar. Your different outcomes can be, you could ascribe a lot of it to the actual structure of the school, the education, whatever is actually happening in terms of the four walls of the education. But there's a bunch more behind that, which is like national identity, family priorities, all these other things. And so I think it's actually pretty difficult to disambiguate in these conversations where you're comparing the U.S. to a nation of 15 million people or 20 million people or something. And so I don't find it that helpful, other than that to see that, hey, it's possible to get really great outcomes for a much more efficient spending. And so there's something broken here that is not that is not just chalked up to the stuff we talked about earlier.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I'm originally from Brazil, and the high school that I went to, I mean, it was private. I had scholarship there, and it, it ended up being. I mean, it's one of the best, I think, schools in the globe. Because I mean, if you look at, in terms of results, like a lot of the people end up, going to the top schools here in the U.S. and like being um, like a lot of the students end up doing really really well even afterwards, but that's not the majority of Brazil. And I I would imagine here in the US you have schools that do it really well, but it's not like the public system, in general, is not, it might not be as good in terms of dollars spent, compared to other countries. And so, I mean, you mentioned a little bit about testing scores and things like that. Um, how does that translate to like later stages in life? Like, how does the education? I mean, you also mentioned there are other factors, and uh, maybe there are studies that show, oh, look, or in your experience, like you've seen how that can affect someone's future. But how does that translate to the workforce and things like that? And my question related to that is because, for example, for in the US, you have a, I think the US is the most like in my view, it's one of the most entrepreneurial countries in the
Yep.
globe, and that's why we end up seeing so many great companies like Apple, Microsoft, Tesla, and so on. But at the same time, we're spending a lot of time in a lot of money in education. Maybe that doesn't translate into results. So my question is more like, how does that translate to later, like to someone's results later in their life?
Yeah. I mean, there's all sorts of ways that people slice this data. So you can look at it by academic outcomes compared to income, like future income, earning potential. You can look at academic outcomes compared to family life, divorce rates, number of kids, all this kind of stuff. So I think it really depends on how you define success, or what you care about and what you want to optimize for. But certainly there is like correlation between academic outcomes and what the world would define as success, meaning income you're going to earn over your lifetime, and stable family life, and having a stable housing situation, and all those things. So there's an obvious correlation there. What I think is interesting is that the American education system was essentially like industrialized in a way that was actually very similar to, and we can talk about maybe unpacking this, but there's sort of multiple components of why the public education system needed to exist. One of it's like you needed a place for your kids to go while you went and worked. And the industrialization of the US education system, if you think about what the experience is for a K through 12 student, it's not that different than working an industrial job. And in some ways, the sort of post-industrial jobs are these very linear careers where you would sort of join a company and you would go work there for 50 years, and you would work a 9 to 5, and you would then retire, and you would just kind of, that was sort of like that was what everyone wanted to do. It's not that different than, getting into a school at kindergarten, and you're there for 13 years, and you follow a set schedule every day, and you do exactly what you're told. And by the end of it, you get a high school diploma, and you're on to college or onto a job. And everyone knows the world has changed, and everyone knows that these sort of linear, hyperlinear career trajectories of just working in the same place for a couple decades and slowly moving your way up, and working a 9 to 5 is not only not the reality for many people, but it's also not desirable for a lot of people. Most people want to be in much more creative experiences. They want to, be not thinking of their career as just sort of like one chunk of 40 years. They think about this in terms of what they want to pursue and what they're excited about, and they're starting companies or writing books or doing all sorts of things. And so we think about primer, and what I think that the traditional education system is really missing is like this sort of the way that career paths have evolved is no longer looks like just an extension of the K through 12 system as it exists in America. And so for the first time between the industrial era and the post-industrial era, you had basically this pretty clean correlation between what your K through 12 experience would be like and what your career would look like, and you could just kind of continue on through. And there's all sorts of cynical takes on why it was designed that way, but I think now that what everyone can agree on, regardless of why you believe it was designed that way, what everyone can agree on is that is no longer reflects what the experience of most people want out of their career. And so our goal with things like Primer, where we give kids time to, every kid at Primer has hours a day where they spend going deep on things they're excited about, whether that's writing a book or, studying microbiology or launching a podcast or whatever they're excited about, starting a business. That's important for kids, in my view, for kids to start doing it at a very young age. We're talking like second, third, fourth grade, to start building those skills of like understanding agency, understanding how they spend their time, and being able to go deep on things that they really feel this sort of intrinsic motivation, this passion around. And I believe that's important for them to cultivate, because that is what's going to set them apart once they graduate, once they go into their career, and that's what's going to help them find their potential and their passion in life. And so there's things like that I just think structurally the traditional system is not set up for.
Interesting. Yeah, I really like that analogy of the industrial system and how it's like all linear, and how Primer is moving away from that, the same way that we're moving, like in terms of society. People are more creative, they're writing, like more people are on the internet, for example, they're launching podcasts. I mean, I have this podcast
Like
as
this
an
one.
example. Yeah, exactly. But I think one interesting part that you talked about is related to this project, and how kids are pursuing these different ideas. And it reminded me of a conversation that Nat Friedman was talking about, how progress, in general, progress, what we've seen is in society has happened because we're raising the ceiling and not necessarily just
Yep.
pushing the floor. And I wonder if there is that sort of thing will happen in education, where if you raise the ceiling for kids, and I mean, that at least that was my experience in the high school that I described. If kids were doing like really well in math, they really pushed them, and we had tutors that would help us in math or physics or whatever. But I wonder if that's the same for the education system. If we improve the education system by pushing the ceiling, is that a good analogy, or is that how Primer is thinking? Or
Yeah, I think so directionally, yes. I think if you put the politics aside, I think it's obviously insane that if a kid is good at something and good at math or reading or whatever, their education experience should be like a treadmill. It should be infinite. They should be able to go as fast or as long as they want. There should be no marginal cost to them to do that. They should be able to just keep going. And I think that's obvious. Like anyone who's making, in my opinion, arguments against that is doing it from a political lens or some sort of other agenda. So that we take that as just like a sort of obvious reality. The question on the floor is really like how do you define the floor? So we have students that come to Primer from the traditional education system. They've been in public school for 3 years in a really bad public school. By the time they're in third grade, they're already a grade level behind or 2 grade levels behind. And so in the sense, I think where I agree with Nat and where I think it applies to education is you want to spend, a lot of places spend too much energy trying to raise the floor, and they basically ignore the ceiling, and that's very detrimental to humanity. And so clearly you want kids to be able to go as fast and as long as they want to. That being said, on the floor side, I think that we have a sort of imperative now, unfortunately, because of how bad the public system is, where we basically have to find a way to help these kids get caught up. And because if you are, there's this data that shows that the third grade is like this chasm, where if you're behind in reading or in math in third grade, it is very difficult for you. Statistically, you are very unlikely to ever catch up. And so when kids come to Primer in second or third grade, we spend an insane amount of energy and effort and resources trying to get them caught up. And we've had kids that came in, a third grader that came in and every kid at primer sets their goals for the year. And he said, he told his teacher, he said, his micro school leader, he said, I want to learn to read this year. I'm sick of getting made fun of. I'm sick of not being able to read. I want to learn to read. And that kid worked probably 2.5 hours every single day for months and was working one-on-one with a tutor. His parents were bought in, and he came in testing in the first percentile for math and reading. And he worked so hard on reading, and we set him up with a one-on-one tutor that he worked with. And about 12 weeks later, or 13 weeks later, he was in the 30th percentile for reading. He jumped 29 percentiles over that period, and was by the end of the year more or less on grade level. And now it took a freaking Herculean effort by him. It was not easy. And this is the third grader. It's like incredibly motivated, incredibly disciplined, and the system just failed him. And so I think that we have a sort of we talk about primer often as this like civilizationally important problem to solve. So I am generally, my bias is always towards raise the ceiling. Like that's the way the progress is going to happen. But I think in the sense that you have these kids that have been failed by the system and that need to be accelerated and need some way to get back on track, you have to invest there, especially for early elementary, because the consequences of them not getting caught up by third or fourth grade are so high for the rest of their education and then the rest of their life, that it's a very good investment from a societal perspective to try to get them caught up.
That's super interesting. That's a really cool story. And when you mention about the vision for the student for the year, I think there was a study that compared students that they had a vision for 5 years from now, so what they wanted to achieve 5 years from now, and the students that didn't think about 5 years from now, and the students that really thought about what they wanted to achieve, in a few years from now, did much better than the other students. So I wonder if that also played out in the year plan, but that definitely improved. In that case that you mentioned, that definitely improved the test score. Are there other techniques or things that you've seen that can actually help students like push themselves, or even not the students, but motivate the students to do better? Like, have you seen some techniques like that? And I'll give you one example that, for example, in the high school that I went, like there was definitely, for us, we would, see the older folks that did really well. And that's how we were motivated. We were like, oh, yeah, I want to be like it. Or, yeah. But have you seen some other techniques or like some other forms where students do better?
Yeah, so every student at primer, we show them, they take a placement test, and we show them basically their academic goals for the year, and we show them where they're at, what on grade level would look like, whether they're ahead or behind. And then we show them basically 3 different paces that they can pick for the year. And so they can decide if they want to go sort of standard speed, if they want to go fast, or if they want to go lightning. And we show them how much more time they'll have to work each day and each week if they want to go at one of these faster paces. We also show them where they'll be at the end of the year if they decided to do that. And then kids can choose, and they decide with their parents and with their micro school leader, and then they're held accountable to that by their micro school leader, by their parents. There's a dashboard where you can track their progress, and they can see their progress every single day. So they're not waiting for a parent-teacher conference or report card 8 weeks from now. They can see it in real time. And we found that works extremely well. It's very disorienting for a lot of students if they're coming to primer for the first time, like the idea that they can even just like see how they're tracking in real time, and then B, that they can set a goal around that and that they can decide how fast they want to go is, sort of a new thing for them. The other thing I'll say is that there's a great essay about how by actually one of our investors named Eugene, who he basically it's about how humans are effectively, he calls us status seeking monkeys. And this isn't really the point of the essay, but one of the things that it sort of catalyzed for me was this thought of how you can, every human and every child like is trying to understand the status dynamics of whatever community they're in, whether it's a school or a group of friends or whatever. and every student wants to be cool. They want to be doing the things that are to be doing the behaviors that they perceive to be high status within that group of people. And you see this even with, kindergartners. And then obviously it's extremely obvious in places like middle school and high school. And so we haven't totally cracked this, but I've thought a lot about how do you weaponize that dynamic, which turns toxic in a lot of schools, where you get bullying and you get kids doing, sort of really harmful behaviors to show off and different things. How do you actually sort of weaponize that for the benefit and the growth and development of each student? And so how do you create a culture where the cool thing to do is to start a company and talk about that at lunch, or to launch a podcast and brag about the guests that you got and how excited you are about that. And we've started to see some instances of that where when we see a kid that has a spark for something. So we had a kid that was really excited about being like an NFL statistician and like learning about how the NFL draft works and how to decide which players to draft. And so when I was in Miami one time at the school, I FaceTimed, some friends that worked on an NFL team, and I just had them, talk for a few minutes about the stuff he was working on. And that moment was transformative for him, because he got to talk to a real person that was making decisions on an NFL team about their roster and talk about how he was thinking about it. And I think that those kind of moments, they raise the sort of the perceived status of ambition, and the perceived status of wanting to work hard on something and having dreams. And we haven't, like I said, we haven't cracked this yet totally, but I'm pretty sure there's something big there. And we have pretty small environments. The average primer micro school is 26 kids, and so it's you can actually really shape the culture in very specific ways. It's not 3,000 kids that you're trying to create this sort of top down culture from. And so I think that there's something pretty interesting about how you create, how you sort of manufacture it such that the high status behaviors are these things that we talked about: working hard, studying hard, wanting to start companies, podcasts, write book, all those things. And so that's something I'm excited about over the next couple of years.
Yeah, that's really cool. It's interesting because I think even especially for entrepreneurs, I see a trend where when people start early, they tend to do well, and I think it's about practice. If you think about any kind of job, you tend to get better as you do it. So the NFL, if you practice for the NFL for a long time, you tend to do better, like tennis. And even if I think, the Stripe founders, they started a company early on. Brex, they're Brazilian. I know one of the co-founders. He started a company. They both started a company back in high school in Brazil, and they did really well. Even if you think about Mark Zuckerberg or Bill Gates, Bill Gates had a company back in high school that he tried to do it. So it's quite interesting. And one of the things that I also seen is that some people that are not necessarily in the system, meaning they are not in this industrialized system of public schools, college, and whatnot, some of them do really well. So one example is Palmer Luckey, right? And I think there are a few good examples of that, and some of them were homeschooled, and homeschooling has grown a lot. So I think the trend started in the 70s, with around 13,000 kids, and now it's up to 2 million kids. Why is there such a trend in homeschooling, and what are the problems with homeschooling versus other kind of systems?
Yeah, I think it's funny. I understand why people say this, but I think it's funny when people talk about the rise of homeschooling over that period, because homeschooling was basically the default education path of every human that ever existed, besides those that lived in big cities or had lots of money, for a very, very long time. And so it's sort of in some ways, the anomaly is the other way, where you had the vast majority of kids going to this sort of industrialized school. That's actually much more historically, much more, it would be much more anomalous. But I think the sort of resurgence of homeschooling, it's a combination of people that, it's 100% practical. It's just, hey, I don't want my kids to be in an environment where they're told, what they need to think, or I don't want them to sort of be in this hyper structured environment. I want them to have more time to be able to explore things they're excited about. But then it's also, like, I think it unlocks a totally different, there's sort of like the practical structural stuff, but then there's this whole other like sort of world that it unlocks. Like when I was homeschooled, my mom, when it was time to learn about the American Revolution, she didn't buy us textbooks about the American Revolution. She put us in a minivan and we drove from Florida up the coast and we visited all the 13 colonies. We spent 3 weeks, staying in very crappy hotels, like, visiting all the different, sites. And her and my dad saved up their money to make that happen because they knew that that would be a transformative experience for our education around the American Revolution and the founding of America for me and my siblings. And it was. The first time I saw Hamilton, I cried because I like the American Revolution has always been this like amazing thing to me that I've loved and I've read so much about. And I think I could trace it back to that experience of going on that trip when like it all sort of was like brought to life to me at this very formative age. And so I think that for a lot of families, homeschooling just unlocks a totally different way of doing life that, sure, you can say like all the data shows that academic outcomes are better, that homeschoolers outperform on basically every metric that matters. But it also unlocks just totally different quality of life in terms of being able to travel. I have so many friends that are homeschooling their kids or homeschooling with like, they have a few teachers that kind of come in a few days a week and teach their kids certain things, but those teachers travel with them and they can, they want to go on a vacation, they can go on a vacation and they're not beholden to the calendar, anyone's calendar. So there's all sorts of other benefits of homeschooling. But I think that it's in general, most, 95% of homeschoolers are doing it because they feel like they can deliver a better education outcome for their kids than, the alternative at the public school.
Very interesting. And in terms of systems, so I think Primer now is focused on microschools, right?
Yep.
And like, what are the differences between homeschooling and microschools and even the traditional system? Like, what are the pros and cons of each one? Yeah.
So, the best, I think microschools at their best are effectively like productized homeschooling. So if you associate with homeschooling, high agency environment, kids able to move at their own pace, kids able to have a lot of time and resources to go deep on things they're excited about. That's what microschools should be. The challenge with homeschooling and why I think homeschooling will never go mainstream, defined as 20+% of U.S. students being homeschooled, is because you have this, at least in the current economy, over the last few decades, you have this immovable barrier, which is like one parent has to stay home with the kids. And so even if you have parents who, one of which is desires to homeschool, one of which is equipped to be able to teach and homeschool, you have to be in a financial situation where like one of those parents can stay home. You have to be in a marital situation where one of the, you have two parents at home or one of them can stay home. And so it's just very challenging for that to ever go like sort of super mainstream. And so I think micro schools are the goal. Like a lot of how I think about Primer is giving the best of a homeschool like experience, but without the need for one parent to stay home. You sort of still get the, hey, my child's going to be at this place for 8 to 3 every day, and I can have a job or work, whatever. And so you still get that part of the traditional school experience with hopefully a much different actual experience for the kids day to day.
At some point in the US, I think the majority of cases were not that both parents were working. And it seems that right now, even to have a good life, quote unquote, good life here in the US, both parents have to work in average.
Yeah. And that's assuming both parents are even at home, that the parents are still together and,
Exactly.
parenting, raising the kids together. So yeah, I totally agree.
And I wonder if, I think it's related how money is broken here in the US. And I wonder if at some point we'll get into a situation where people have the choice of just one parent working if they are together. And if that changes some social interaction, so like, for example, education. But besides that, you talked a little bit about microschooling, that basically you're creating a product around this great experience of achieving better results and things like that. But a huge part of it, so I mean, the whole goal of the company is to create this system for kids. um, and an entrepreneurial experience is like a really long entrepreneurial experience, right? And it's hard, and I mean, you really need to have a lot of motivation in order to go through different barriers. So I would love to understand what was the motivation behind starting Primer and making it uh, uh, this business.
Yeah, the original motivation was this was very similar to the experience that I had growing up in my education, and I wanted my kids to have a similar kind of education to that. And so Primer's goal is to create a ubiquitous option for families, and not just wealthy families, but middle class, lower middle class families, where they can have an exceptional micro school option in their neighborhood or very very nearby, that's led by a teacher that they respect and trust, and has the sort of Primer platform and technology behind it. And I think that's I'm deeply deeply convinced that micro schools, the structural advantages of micro schools, allow them to be the answer to the current education crisis in the US. And I think that there's just so many advantages, from how quickly you can launch them to the very very low overhead and operating cost. They can use existing real estate, so you don't have to do a bunch of build outs. It's much easier from a permitting and land use perspective. And there's hundreds of thousands of teachers that want to quit their jobs and are not happy with what they're doing, and want a better option. And so micro schools allow them to have more autonomy, make more money, feel like they're more in the driver's seat of the kids and the experience they're delivering. And I think that's all those things kind of come together into a pretty amazing opportunity right now, to hopefully create something that becomes that alternative to the families that feel stuck in the traditional system.
Interesting. So you're saying that there are lots of teachers in the traditional system that are not happy with the way the system is, and they would like to, spend time in micro schools. Is that right? And if that's so, like, what are the problems that like they encounter in the traditional system?
Yeah, there was just McKinsey just put out a report, which I find hilarious that I'm quoting a McKinsey report, but they just put out a report that 1/3 of teachers last year considered quitting their jobs.
Wow.
And I mean, there's public data on this. You can look at it. A lot of times school districts, like district by districts, will actually release it. But yeah, teachers are quitting in droves or want to quit. I think it's a combination of, there's this sort of it's a little bit like death by a thousand cuts, where there's so much, especially if you're like in special education, if you're a special education teacher, there's so much bureaucracy around being a teacher now. And if you're someone who's really motivated by, hey, I just want to come in every day, positively impact these kids' lives, help them learn, help them make progress, get them a better chance of reaching their potential, there's so much other stuff that you have to do. And some of it is paperwork, some of it is process. I mean, the stories that we hear from these teachers is just insane. And so I think that like there's a certain amount of, like, you can put up with some amount of bureaucracy and some amount of administrative cruft or whatever, but past a certain point you're just like, hey, I can't handle this anymore. And probably, like, most of this stuff was well intentioned. Someone created some regulation that they thought would help some specific thing, but when that's the 27th checklist that someone has to deal with, as a special education teacher in Florida, at some point you're just like, screw this, like I'm not dealing with this anymore. They don't pay me enough money, and I don't want to spend my weekends filling out paperwork. And so I mean, every educator's story is different as to why they're not happy, but that's a lot of the kind of stories that we hear, is around this sort of bureaucracy, administration, sort of this feeling of like the thing that they love is now a tiny part of their job instead of the core of their job. And then at Primer, that is like the core of their job, is getting to be with kids.
Interesting. And I assume a big part of how the education system does well is around the teacher, right? And and great teachers, they definitely have an impact. At least in my experience, I had really great teachers, and that made a huge difference.
Yep.
For for me personally. How do you incentivize great teachers, and like what does it mean to be a great teacher, at least inside primary?
Yeah, I mean, our definition is definitely different than the traditional definition. As an aside, I have this theory that parents, how parents say like, "Oh, we love our school, like we love our school, like we have an amazing school," and my theory is that the vast majority of the time, what they really love is the teacher, and that the school is like almost irrelevant or a very very small percentage of their overall perception of their child's education, especially for elementary when it's a single teacher that you like is the bulk of the day is driven by a single teacher. That experience is like make or break, and so one of the things that we found is that parents are very loyal to teachers, and they're not really loyal to schools, but they're loyal to teachers. And so, we think a lot about how do we make the micro school leader be the face of, like, we want parents to know they're coming to a primer school. We want the primer band to signal quality, but we want them to feel like I'm going to Miss April's micro school in Miami. And I'm so excited about that. And I love Miss April and she's amazing. And we want her to build a real connection with these families. And we want her to feel like she's launching her own school. So it's kind of our posture towards it. What we look for is really three things. The first is, are they exceptional academically? So obviously that's kind of table stakes. Like, can they help kids make real academic progress towards their goals? We are especially, we sort of over-index on math and reading, especially for elementary, and are probably more than most schools. Like, that's where we spend a lot of energy and a lot of time in the interview process. The second piece is, are they do they have sort of that like X factor entrepreneurial gene, because they're really launching their own school, like they're kind of starting their own business. And so are they do they have kind of the operational chops, the like executive chops to kind of run their own shop? And are they going to be able to just figure things out when they need to go, things that are outside of the traditional scope of teaching? Like, are they just going to be able to go figure out in terms of like recruiting students? We ask them to put together a recruiting plan so we can see how they think about that. And then the final piece, and this is probably the most important and the hardest to find, is people that don't think within the confines of the traditional system. And so, to go back to like the NFL draft example that I talked about, we'll give them scenarios, and we'll say something like, hey, imagine you have a kid that's really interested in, being an NFL statistician. And he's got 2 hours a day for the whole school year to work towards something about related to this that he's excited about. What would you do? And 9 out of 10 teachers will tell you, oh, I'd have him, read some books about it and then write a book report, or I'd have him do a trifold board that we would then do like a science fair type presentation about, or, all these things that would happen in like the, random public school down the street. And 1 in 10 or 1 in 20 teachers will say, oh, I would try to find a local, NFL team, or find a local pro sports team that would be willing to let him or her do like an internship for a day, or meet the person that's in charge of this and have him put together like a bunch of proposals and then send those to them and see if I could get them to give feedback to the student that's really interested in it. And you can just tell they're thinking in a totally different dimension than a normal teacher. And that's the stuff that we look for, because we don't have the confines of the traditional system. We have so much more flexibility and freedom on what the student experience can look like. And so, when a student is interested in illustration, I'm figuring out, hey, how can I get a Pixar illustrator to mentor this kid who really wants to be a Pixar illustrator one day? Like, that's the kind of stuff that we think about. And so, it turns out it's very difficult to find. And I don't think it's because, teachers innately don't think this way. I just think that after you spent so much time in the traditional system, you stop thinking in that those kind of things are possible. And so that third piece is probably the hardest one for us to find when we're recruiting.
That's awesome. That's that's really cool. I bet the students that, you shared the story of the student that was talking to some people that worked in the NFL. He was really excited, or she was really excited, and that's very cool to see. A point related to how teachers do and how they perform. I've seen a trend of individuals versus institutions. So, and that across different fields. And I think part of it is because distribution became so cheap that you end up empowering individuals. And I've seen it in media. So you have people that have a bigger voice than like TV channels. In let's say journalism, you have people that have Substacks and things like that that have more. They reach to more people. Investors, I've seen individual investors have bigger funds than traditional VC firms. Even some of the most well known. And I wonder if primer, like for YouTube, for example, there's like 3 blue, 1 brown. Like
Yep.
there are forms of teaching that are not necessarily in the traditional way. And I wonder if um, when you think about schools, you're thinking about these individuals. And like, have you seen that trend in education in some other way, where you see individuals doing really, really well uh, on the internet?
Yeah. I mean, our micro school leaders are like sort of a microcosm of that without the internet zero marginal cost internet scale component. Like we're taking someone who was an exceptional teacher and we're letting them launch their own business, and they're kind of like a celebrity to their to their neighborhood when they launch this. But that doesn't have the distribution side that you're talking about. On that side, we haven't spent that much time on it, but there's a lot of things that we will do once we get to a larger scale where you can have. So 3 Blue 1 Brown is a perfect example where 3 Blue 1 Brown. I mean, if you haven't seen his videos, it's unbelievable. And he's better. His stuff is better than probably 99.9 or maybe add more nines percent of the math teachers in the U.S. that are teaching the same material. And there's something pretty amazing about the fact that you could pay someone like imagine paying someone like 3 Blue 1 Brown a ton of money to create all the math content for a network of schools like Primer Microschools, and how much money you could pay them, and then have that then distributed and basically replacing the math teachers or the primary math content delivery for 200 schools or 2,000 schools. And so the thing that we do think a lot about is how do you pair the magic of the internet with the importance of the day-to-day physical, hey, you have a micro school leader and a studio guide that are there on site, that know you, that love you, that care about you, that if your cat dies, it's going to know your cat's name and be sad with you and all that. And so I think that balance is where the magic is, because you can take the best of the sort of internet scale, internet distribution, zero marginal cost stuff that is happening, and you can even catalyze some of that and hire some of these people, and then you can distribute that to a network of schools where kids are getting the best of the instruction that can happen through the internet, with a combination of still a physical in-person, because it's not good for kids to just be sitting on their laptop all day, learning through YouTube videos. That is amazing for certain things that they want to go deep on and rabbit holes, but having a third grader spend 8 hours a day on the computer is not the optimal thing for their development. And so figuring out how you can combine those two into sort of a blended experience, I think that's where there's a lot of magic, and that's what we do spend a lot of time thinking about, and as we scale, we'll spend more and more time on.
That's awesome. So last topic that I wanted to discuss, and this is a little bit more, I wanted to understand your view there. So I think that happened for example, newspapers, where you see the best people, they can actually, because of the zero cost of distribution, you can distribute to anyone. The best people don't necessarily go to these institutions, and they go outside the institution. So that's Substack. It's one example of like enabler. And then you have the media, you have in other areas. But one thing that I've noticed, and it's not necessarily it's not necessarily at the same stage as these other institutions, but I think we're starting to see some trends, and that's my opinion. So that's academia, the education after university, colleges, and things like that. And it feels like, for example, Harvard, if you think about like the traditional institutions, the Ivy Leagues and whatnot, they're a bundler. Like they bundle education, but also they have research.
Yep.
And in some ways, I think, for example, if you think about OpenAI or Cruise or like all these companies, quote unquote companies, they are in some ways the research labs that were once in traditional academia. So if you think about OpenAI, um, I think in the past you would seen that kind of work being done in academia, but at the same time, um, you know, like some of the best entrepreneurs that I've seen, they they sometimes they leave college even before, and academia ends up being just a stamp saying, look, this person like entered the social club. And I think Peter Thiel has this saying that like academia is just a club where you get that stamp and you're like, oh, I'm good. Like you have what it takes for the future, and it's not really an educational system and things like that. um, how do you see academia in general, and how do you see that evolving? Do you think we'll get into a stage where there's an opportunity for Primer or companies that are like Primer to attack that market? I would assume that for Primer, the schooling that is done before, not in universities and whatnot, is much worse than like it's in a much worse state. Like I would assume that's the case, and I think academia is in that spiral. It's just starting. We're just starting to see. I wonder if that's the case, and like if you see a eventually an opportunity there, or like what do you see the future of education in that area?
Yeah. So I'll preface this by saying I'm not an expert in higher ed. So far less informed on my thoughts on higher ed than K-12. I think what it's been well documented and well discussed is the sort of unbundling of higher ed. And I think certainly like there's every macro trend in the world is now away from, fewer kids are going to college degrees matter less, all that. I think the unbundling is probably the most interesting part as far as, how K through 12 plays in, is that if it's possible to sort of sufficiently unbundle it such that you could have the credentialing be detached from a 4-year degree, you could imagine a world where the last 2 years of high school had some level of credentialing attached to it, such that you could get, some number of jobs or career opportunities or apprenticeships or whatever, where that credential was enough to get you in the door. And that I think is like completely possible. And I think more high schools should be trying this and trying to figure this out, because there's a number of professions that are excellent professions in America that you can have a great career, retire at 60, have great savings, live a great life, own a house, all that, that don't require a college degree. They might require technical training, and they might require some, secondary education beyond just high school, but you could certainly have some level of credential or intent that comes out of high school. You could do apprenticeships your junior and senior year of high school, thinking about things like small business owners, HVAC companies, things that are like, very, very stable, good economics, like jobs that, we know are good jobs. There's really, I think, a huge opportunity for high schools to get more in the game there. So that part of it, I think, is interesting. And I think the unbundling and the sort of specifically the credentialing aspect is probably where high schools can play the most. I think that the everything else, as far as, it's going to be, there's no, I mean, it's a fool's errand for any K through 12 school to try to replace Harvard, or, I mean, there's so much societal inertia behind these things that is slowly being undone, but it's not, no K through 12 school is going to, snap their fingers and do that. So I'm much more interested in the hyper pragmatic stuff around, if you have a kid who is 16 and is like, I want to go, launch my own HVAC service business, or I want to become an auto mechanic and own my own body shop or whatever. And they know they want to do that. Then how do you give them the most efficient path to that with zero debt and the fastest path to the maximum amount of income, and they can change their mind and do something else. You're not putting them on a one-way ticket that's irreversible. But the current system to getting to that point is not efficient, and it could be substantially more efficient. And then there's things like welding, technical training, all these things that you could do for a lot of people that would be very easy to do within the confines of a K through 12 experience, where you could get them 80% of the way there before they graduate high school. And by any metric, that's going to be a better outcome for those kids. So that's the kind of stuff that I'm more interested in. It's a long time before we get there, but that's what I've thought about.
Awesome. This conversation was really insightful. Thank you so much, Ryan. Where can people find you online if they want to find you?
Yeah, Primer is just primer.com, primer.com. So if you have, families or teachers that are in Florida or Arizona, that's where we operate now. We're going to be coming to a lot more states soon, but Florida and Arizona, the teachers that want to launch their own microschools, I'd love to talk to them, or parents that are looking for better education options for their kids, we'd love to talk to them. And then I'm just at Delk, DELK on Twitter, and always happy to chat with people if I can be helpful.
All right. Thank you so much. And yeah, I hope Primer keeps crushing it. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks for having me.